"Sir, you cannot stay in that seat." The sentence cut through the quiet first-class cabin only minutes before boarding was scheduled to end. Several passengers looked up immediately. A few paused their phone calls. Others lowered newspapers and tablets. Standing beside seat 2A was a black businessman named Darius Coleman. He wore a tailored navy travel jacket, dark slacks, and polished shoes. Nothing about him suggested concern. Nothing about him suggested embarrassment. Yet the flight attendant standing in front of him seemed completely certain that he did not belong there. Her name tag read Linda Parker. She folded her arms and pointed toward the rear of the aircraft. "You need to leave first class immediately." Darius looked at her calmly. "May I ask why?" Linda seemed surprised by the question. "Because this seat is reserved." Darius glanced toward the seat and then back at her. "I understand that." Linda nodded. "Then you understand why you need to move." The passengers nearby exchanged curious looks. Darius remained perfectly composed. "I believe this seat was assigned to me." Linda immediately shook her head. "No, sir. There has clearly been a mistake." Darius looked down at his boarding pass before returning his attention to her. "Has anyone reviewed the executive passenger file?" Linda frowned. "That is not necessary." Darius smiled politely. "It may be." The answer only seemed to frustrate her further. She had already decided what the situation was. As far as she was concerned, the discussion was finished. "Sir, I am asking you again to leave this seat." Darius slowly placed his travel bag beneath the seat in front of him. "Before I do that, I would appreciate a review of the records." Several passengers now watched openly. One businessman sitting across the aisle leaned forward with interest. Another passenger removed an earbud to hear more clearly. Linda noticed the attention and became even more determined to resolve the situation quickly. "There is no need to review anything," she said firmly. "The correct passenger for this seat has not boarded yet." Darius nodded slowly. "Are you certain?" Linda answered immediately. "Yes." Darius sat down. Not aggressively, not defiantly, simply as though he had every reason to remain where he was. The reaction caught Linda off guard. Most travelers would have become defensive by now. Some would have argued. Others would have demanded a supervisor. Darius did neither. He simply remained calm. That calmness made the situation feel strangely uncomfortable. "Sir," Linda said again, lowering her voice, "please cooperate." Darius looked up at her. "I am cooperating." "Then leave the seat." "After the records are checked." Linda stared at him. The confidence in his voice did not sound like a guess. It sounded like certainty. Around the cabin, whispers quietly spread between passengers. People began forming their own opinions. Some assumed Darius had made a mistake. Others suspected there was more to the story. Yet no one knew the truth. Darius glanced out the window toward the busy airport ramp where service vehicles moved beneath the afternoon sun. Then he looked back at Linda. "I only asked one question." Linda sighed. "And what question is that?" Darius answered calmly. "Has anyone checked the executive passenger file?" Linda opened her mouth to respond, but before she could speak, a member of the gate staff stepped into the aircraft carrying a tablet. He approached the front of the cabin and quietly whispered something to another crew member. The expression on that crew member's face changed instantly. Darius noticed. Linda noticed. The passengers noticed. Something unexpected had just entered the situation. And although nobody in the cabin understood it yet, the flight they expected to depart on time was about to be delayed because of a passenger most people believe should never have been sitting in first class at all. The crew member who had received the message from the gate agent walked quickly toward the front galley and lowered her voice. Even though the passengers could not hear the conversation, they immediately sensed that something had changed. Linda Parker listened carefully, glanced toward Darius Coleman, and then shook her head as if rejecting whatever possibility had just been suggested. Darius noticed the reaction but remained seated. He showed no sign of concern. The businessman across the aisle continued watching with growing interest. A woman seated 2 rows behind first class quietly leaned forward, hoping to understand what was happening. Within minutes, the atmosphere inside the cabin felt very different from a normal boarding process. People were no longer focused on departure times. They were focused on Darius. Linda returned to seat 2A with renewed determination. "Sir, I need you to come with me." Darius looked up calmly. "Has the file been reviewed?" Linda exhaled slowly. "That is being handled." Darius nodded. "Good." Linda seemed irritated by the answer. "In the meantime, I need you to wait in the boarding area until this is resolved. Darius looked at her for several seconds before standing. He did not argue. He did not complain. He simply reached for his travel bag and stepped into the aisle. The reaction surprised everyone nearby. Several passengers had expected resistance. Instead, Darius cooperated immediately. The businessman across the aisle shook his head slightly. There was something unusual about a man who remained this calm while being removed from a seat he claimed belonged to him. As Darius followed Linda toward the aircraft door, dozens of eyes followed him. Some passengers assumed the matter was finished. Others felt the opposite. The confidence Darius displayed did not resemble the confidence of someone who had been caught making a mistake. It looked like the confidence of someone who knew the story was not over. Once inside the jet bridge, Linda stopped and turned toward him. You can wait here until the records are checked. Darius set his travel bag beside the wall and nodded. That is fine. Linda appeared surprised again. You are taking this very well. Darius smiled politely. There is no reason not to. Most people would be upset. Most people are not interested in waiting for facts. The answer lingered in the air between them. Before Linda could respond, another notification appeared on her company device. She checked it quickly. Her expression changed for only a fraction of a second. Darius noticed. Something wrong, he asked. Linda immediately locked the screen. No. Yet her voice lacked the certainty it carried earlier. Back inside the aircraft, boarding had officially ended. Flight attendants completed final cabin checks. Passengers fastened seat belts and prepared for departure. Everything appeared normal. Everything except one detail. Seat 2A remained empty. Several passengers continued glancing toward it. The businessman who had watched the entire situation finally pressed the call button. A crew member approached. Yes, sir. The businessman pointed toward the empty seat. Who was supposed to sit there? The flight attendant hesitated. I am not authorized to discuss passenger information. The businessman nodded. Fair enough. Yet even he could tell something unusual was happening. Meanwhile, inside the cockpit, Captain Michael Reed reviewed the final departure report. His eyes moved down the list automatically until they stopped on a highlighted notification. He frowned. Then he read it again. One line immediately caught his attention. An executive-level passenger associated with the flight had not been confirmed on board. Michael leaned forward. That was impossible. According to the manifest, every passenger had already been processed. Yet the system continued displaying the same warning. He picked up the communication handset and contacted ground operations. I need clarification on an executive passenger alert. A brief silence followed. Then the voice on the other end answered with unexpected urgency. Captain, do not close the aircraft door yet. Michael sat upright immediately. Why? Another pause followed. Because we believe the wrong passenger may have been removed from the aircraft. Captain Michael Reed lowered the handset slowly and stared at the warning message on his screen. During thousands of flights, he had seen passenger disputes, booking errors, and last-minute seat changes. He had never seen a departure alert like this one. The executive passenger designation attached to the file carried a priority level reserved for only a handful of travelers each year. More importantly, the system continued showing the same message. Passenger not on board. Verification incomplete. Departure not authorized. Michael immediately contacted ground operations again. I need the name associated with that alert. A few seconds passed. Then the response arrived. We are still confirming, Captain. Please keep the aircraft at the gate. Michael glanced at the departure clock. Every minute of delay created complications. Yet the urgency in the agent's voice left no room for debate. Understood, he replied. Back in the cabin, passengers were beginning to notice that the aircraft was not moving. Seatbelt signs remained illuminated. Cabin doors remained open. The businessman sitting near the front checked his watch and looked toward the galley. Several others exchanged confused looks. A flight attendant made a routine announcement about a temporary delay, but the explanation sounded vague even to the crew delivering it. Meanwhile, in the jet bridge, Darius Coleman sat calmly on a bench beside the window. Travelers walked past carrying luggage and coffee cups. Airport announcements echoed from distant speakers. To anyone passing by, he appeared completely relaxed. Linda Parker stood nearby reviewing messages on her device. The longer she read, the less confident she became. Every update seemed to raise additional questions instead of providing answers. Finally, she looked toward Darius. You seem unusually calm. Darius smiled. Should I be worried? Linda hesitated. Most people would be. Most people probably know less than they think. Linda frowned slightly. What does that mean? Darius looked out toward the aircraft parked at the gate. It means assumptions can feel very convincing. Before she could respond, her device vibrated again. This time, the message came directly from airport operations. Her eyes widened as she read it. The note instructed her to remain where she was and await contact from the captain. No further details were provided. Back on the aircraft, Captain Reed received a second communication. This one came from a senior operations manager. The manager's tone was serious from the very first sentence. Captain, we are conducting an immediate review of an executive passenger file. Michael leaned forward. Is this related to the missing passenger alert? Yes. Do we know who the passenger is? A brief pause followed. We believe we do. We are verifying final authorization records now. Michael looked at the empty first-class seat displayed on the cabin monitor. Something about the entire situation felt wrong. Not complicated. Wrong. He had learned long ago that systems rarely generate multiple executive warnings without a reason. If the aircraft was being held at the gate, someone important was connected to the problem. Very important. A few rows back, passengers continued discussing the delay. Some speculated about weather. Others guessed a maintenance issue. Only a handful connected the delay to the man who had been removed from first class. Yet the businessman near the front had begun forming a different theory. He remembered the confidence in Darius's voice. He remembered the repeated request to review the executive passenger file. Most of all, he remembered that Darius never once tried to prove anything. He simply asked people to check the records. The businessman leaned back in his seat and smiled slightly. For the first time, he was beginning to suspect that the most important passenger connected to the flight was no longer sitting on the aircraft at all. And somewhere inside airline headquarters, a senior executive had just opened a file that would soon explain exactly why Captain Michael Reed was refusing to take off. Inside airline headquarters, the review that began as a routine verification was rapidly attracting attention from departments that rarely became involved in passenger matters. A senior operations executive sat in front of multiple screens, reviewing documents connected to the executive passenger alert. At first, he expected to find a simple booking discrepancy. Instead, he found layers of authorization records that required additional clearance. Every time a file opened, another reference appeared. Every reference pointed toward the same passenger. Darius Coleman. The executive leaned back in his chair and immediately contacted another department. I need complete verification on this profile. Across the country, additional personnel began reviewing the same records. Back at the airport, Captain Michael Reed remained inside the cockpit. The aircraft was fully boarded. The cabin was secure. Weather conditions were perfect. Yet the aircraft remained parked at the gate. Several passengers were now openly asking questions. Flight attendants continued offering polite explanations, but nobody could explain why departure approval had not been issued. The businessman seated near the front had become convinced that the delay was connected to Darius. Every update seemed to reinforce that suspicion. Near the jet bridge window, Darius continued waiting patiently. He occasionally checked his watch, but otherwise appeared completely relaxed. Linda Parker found his calmness increasingly difficult to understand. Most travelers facing the same situation would have been frustrated long ago. Darius seemed almost amused by how events were unfolding. Finally, Linda broke the silence. You really expected this to happen, did you not? Darius looked toward her. Expected what? The delay. Darius smiled slightly. I expected someone would eventually review the correct information. Linda folded her arms. You keep saying that. Because it remains true. Before she could reply, her company device rang. The caller identification displayed a number she immediately recognized from airline operations management. She answered at once. The conversation lasted less than 30 seconds. Yet when it ended, her expression had completely changed. What happened? Darius asked politely. Linda hesitated. The captain wants a full timeline of everything that occurred before you left the aircraft. Darius nodded. That seems reasonable. Linda stared at him. Once again, he sounded unsurprised. Meanwhile, inside the cockpit, Captain Reed received another call. This time the voice on the line belonged to a senior executive from airline headquarters. The tone was professional but urgent. Captain, Under no circumstances are you authorized to depart until our review is complete. Michael looked at the departure schedule. The delay is becoming significant. We understand. Can you tell me why this passenger is generating executive-level alerts? A brief silence followed. Then the executive answered carefully. Because his profile is connected to agreements that affect the airline at the highest level. Michael sat perfectly still. That answer raised more questions than it solved. Outside the cockpit, passengers continued waiting. Some checked connecting flights. Others watched airport vehicles moving across the ramp. Yet the unusual delay remained unexplained. Near the front of the cabin, the empty first-class seat seemed to attract attention every few minutes. People kept looking at it. People kept remembering the man who had occupied it. Back in headquarters, another file finally opened. The executive reviewing it stared at the screen. Then he read the information a second time. His eyes widened slightly. Without hesitation, he forwarded the document to senior leadership and picked up the phone. "We found it," he said. Across the airport, multiple departments suddenly began moving faster. Notifications were sent. Calls were placed. Approvals were requested. And for the first time since the situation began, the investigation was no longer focused on whether Darius Coleman belonged in first class. The investigation had shifted to a far more important question. How had someone connected to the airline at such an extraordinary level been removed from the aircraft in the first place? The delay had now stretched far beyond what anyone expected. Inside the aircraft, passengers were growing increasingly curious. Yet the usual frustration that accompanied a late departure was strangely absent. Something about the situation felt different. People sensed that the answer was bigger than weather, maintenance, or scheduling. The businessman seated near the front looked once more toward the empty first-class seat. The longer it remained vacant, the more important it seemed. Flight attendants moved through the cabin answering questions, but even they appeared uncertain. Every update from operations seemed to create more mystery instead of less. In the jet bridge, Darius Coleman remained seated beside the large window overlooking the runway. Aircraft taxied in the distance beneath the afternoon sun. Travelers hurried through nearby corridors. Through it all, Darius maintained the same calm expression. Linda Parker stood several feet away reviewing messages as they arrived. Each notification seemed more serious than the last. What had started as a simple seating dispute now involved airport operations, corporate leadership, and the captain himself. She struggled to understand how everything had escalated so quickly. Finally, she looked toward Darius. "I have worked for this airline for 12 years, she said quietly. "I have never seen a review like this." Darius nodded politely. "Neither have I." Linda blinked. "You did not expect this?" Darius smiled slightly. "I expected the records to be checked. Everything after that belongs to the records." The answer lingered in her mind. Back at headquarters, executives continued examining authorization files. The more information they uncovered, the more concerned they became. Several agreements connected to Darius's profile were classified under executive access levels. Multiple divisions were now involved in the verification process. One senior manager reviewed the documentation and immediately forwarded it to legal affairs. Another contacted strategic partnerships. A third requested direct confirmation from the office of the chief executive officer. The review was no longer routine. It had become a priority event. Inside the cockpit, Captain Michael Reed received another update. He opened the message and read it carefully. The information confirmed one thing with certainty. Darius Coleman was not simply an important passenger. His profile was linked to relationships that carried substantial significance for the airline's future operations. Michael leaned back in his seat and looked toward the cabin door. Suddenly, the confidence Darius had displayed from the beginning made perfect sense. He had never tried to prove who he was because he knew the documentation would eventually speak for itself. Meanwhile, a call reached Linda's device. This time, the instruction was clear. She was to remain with Darius until further notice. Additional personnel were on their way. Linda ended the call and stared at the screen for several seconds. Darius noticed. "More questions?" he asked. Linda slowly nodded. "Actually, fewer questions." Darius smiled. "That usually means they are getting closer to the truth." For the first time all afternoon, Linda had no response. Because deep down, she was beginning to realize that the mistake was never about a seat assignment. The mistake was assuming she already knew who Darius Coleman was before anyone bothered to verify the facts. The atmosphere surrounding the flight changed dramatically during the next 20 minutes. What began as a passenger review had evolved into something much larger. Inside airline headquarters, multiple executives were now examining the same collection of files. Legal teams had joined the discussion. Operations managers were reviewing historical agreements. Senior leadership was receiving updates in real time. Every document seemed to confirm the same conclusion. Darius Coleman was connected to the airline in a way few passengers could ever imagine. Yet before any announcement could be made, the final verification process had to be completed. At the airport, Captain Michael Reed remained in constant communication with headquarters. The aircraft still sat at the gate. Fuel calculations were being updated. New departure windows were being prepared. Despite the inconvenience, Michael refused to authorize pushback. The warning attached to Darius's profile remained active, and company leadership had made their instructions perfectly clear. Do not depart. Inside the cabin, passengers were no longer irritated. Curiosity had replaced frustration. Even the flight attendants had begun speaking more quietly. Everyone sensed that an important answer was approaching. The businessman near the front smiled as he watched the empty first-class seat. The longer the review continued, the more convinced he became that Darius had been telling the truth from the very beginning. In the jet bridge, Linda Parker received another message. This one came directly from a vice president within airline operations. Her eyes widened as she read it. The message instructed her to remain professional, avoid further assumptions, and prepare for executive-level guidance. Linda read the message twice. Executive-level guidance. She had never received language like that concerning a passenger. She slowly looked toward Darius. He remained seated by the window, watching aircraft arrive and depart in the distance. His calmness now felt less mysterious and more understandable. "May I ask you something?" Linda said. Darius turned toward her. "Of course. Why did you never tell anyone who you were?" Darius smiled. "Because that was never the issue." Linda frowned. "Most people would have said something immediately." Darius nodded. "Perhaps. But you did not." "No." Linda waited. Darius continued. "When a record exists, people should verify the record. If someone only believes the truth after hearing a title, then the lesson is lost." Linda quietly reflected on his words. For the first time that day, she understood what he meant. The problem had never been a boarding pass. The problem had been certainty without verification. Back at headquarters, the final authorization package arrived. A senior executive opened the documents and reviewed each page carefully. Partnership agreements, ownership disclosures, strategic investment records, long-term corporate commitments. Everything matched. Every signature was verified. Every authorization was valid. The executive immediately picked up the phone and contacted Captain Reed directly. Inside the cockpit, Michael listened carefully as the executive spoke. His expression changed with every sentence. When the call finally ended, he sat quietly for several moments. Then he looked down at the passenger file one more time. Suddenly, everything made sense. The executive alerts, the departure hold, the urgency from headquarters. Darius Coleman was not simply a valuable customer. He was connected to decisions that affected the airline at the highest levels. Michael stood from his seat and prepared to leave the cockpit. Outside, passengers continued waiting without any idea that the truth had finally been confirmed. Inside the jet bridge, Linda's device vibrated again. She opened the message and immediately froze. The subject line contained only 4 words. Final verification complete. Beneath it appeared the information everyone had been searching for. Linda stared at the screen. Then she slowly lifted her eyes toward Darius Coleman. At that moment, she realized the next few minutes were about to change everything. Darius Coleman looked at Linda Parker for a moment and immediately understood what had happened. He had not seen the message on her screen, but he recognized the expression. Doubt had disappeared. Certainty had taken its place. Yet this certainty was very different from the certainty she carried earlier. This certainty came from facts. Linda lowered the device slowly. For several seconds, she could not find the right words. The information displayed before her was far beyond anything she had imagined. The executive passenger file contained details that connected Darius to strategic agreements, long-term investment partnerships, and airline initiatives worth hundreds of millions of dollars. More importantly, the file clearly identified him as one of the most significant external stakeholders associated with the company's future growth plans. Everything had been verified. Everything had been confirmed. Back on the aircraft, Captain Michael Reed stepped out of the cockpit and entered the first-class cabin. Every passenger immediately noticed him. Captains rarely left the cockpit during departure delays unless something important was happening. Michael walked directly toward the lead flight attendant and spoke quietly. Whatever he said caused her eyes to widen. Then she nodded and stepped aside. Several passengers exchanged curious looks. The businessman near the front leaned forward again. He could feel the story approaching its conclusion. Michael then addressed the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We are currently completing a final operational review. We appreciate your understanding." The announcement was professional and brief, but those paying attention noticed something unusual. His tone carried respect, not for the passengers in general, for someone specific. Moments later, Michael exited the aircraft and entered the jet bridge. Linda saw him approaching and immediately stood straighter. Darius remained seated near the window. The captain stopped several feet away and studied him carefully. This was the first time the two men had spoken face to face that day. "Mr. Coleman?" Michael asked. Darius stood and offered a polite handshake. "Captain Reed." Michael accepted it immediately. "I believe we owe you an apology." The words caught Linda completely off guard. Captains did not personally leave aircraft to apologize to passengers. Not during active departure operations. Not while dozens of travelers waited on board. Yet here he was. Darius smiled politely. "I appreciate that." Michael shook his head slightly. "No, I do not think you understand." Headquarters completed the final review. Darius remained calm. "I assumed they would." Michael laughed softly. Even now, Darius showed no surprise. The captain continued. Every record was confirmed. Linda lowered her eyes. Michael looked directly at Darius. "Your executive profile should have triggered an immediate review before any action was taken." Darius nodded. "That was my understanding as well." The statement landed heavily, because from the very beginning, Darius had never claimed special treatment. He had only asked for the procedures to be followed correctly. Michael glanced toward Linda before continuing. "The file we reviewed should have been checked first." Darius offered a small smile. "At least it was checked eventually." Several seconds of silence followed. Then Michael spoke again. "Corporate leadership has asked me to personally escort you back on board." Linda looked up immediately. The significance of the moment was impossible to miss. Not only had the review confirmed Darius's identity, it had elevated the situation to the highest levels of airline leadership. Darius picked up his travel bag. "Thank you, Captain." Together, the three began walking toward the aircraft door. Inside the cabin, passengers noticed movement near the entrance. Conversation stopped. Heads turned. The businessman near the front smiled the moment he saw Darius approaching beside Captain Reed. Suddenly, everything made sense. The delay, the reviews, the executive alerts, the empty first-class seat. And as Darius stepped back onto the aircraft beside the captain himself, every person watching understood that the passenger who had been removed from first class was never the problem. The real problem had been failing to recognize who he truly was before making assumptions. As Darius Coleman walked back into the aircraft beside Captain Michael Reed, the entire cabin fell silent. Conversation stopped instantly. Passengers who had spent the last hour wondering about the delay now watched the scene unfold with complete attention. The empty first-class seat that had attracted so much curiosity suddenly had an owner again. Yet what captured everyone's attention was not the seat itself. It was the fact that the captain was personally escorting Darius back on board. That alone told people everything they needed to know. Captain Reed walked with measured confidence until they reached seat 2A. Then, in full view of the cabin, he turned toward Darius. "Mr. Coleman, on behalf of this airline, I sincerely apologize for what occurred today." The words hung in the air. Several passengers exchanged astonished looks. Some had flown hundreds of times and had never witnessed a captain personally apologize to a passenger. Darius smiled politely. "Thank you, Captain." Michael nodded. "Corporate leadership has completed its review. Every record has been verified." The businessman seated across the aisle leaned back slowly. His suspicions had been correct. The delay had never been about weather, maintenance, or scheduling. It had always been about the man now standing beside seat 2A. Darius placed his travel bag beneath the seat and sat down calmly. No celebration, no dramatic reaction, no attempt to draw attention to himself. The simplicity of the gesture somehow made the moment even more powerful. Near the front galley, Linda Parker stood quietly. The confidence she carried earlier had disappeared completely. In its place was reflection. She replayed every moment from the beginning of the flight. The assumptions, the certainty, the refusal to review the file when Darius first requested it. Everything seemed different now. Captain Reed turned toward the cabin. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for your patience. We expect departure shortly." A few passengers nodded. Others smiled. Yet many continued looking toward Darius. The mystery had finally been solved. The businessman across the aisle eventually spoke. "Sir, I think a lot of us owe you an apology too." Several nearby passengers agreed immediately. Darius looked around the cabin and smiled. "That is not necessary." The businessman shook his head. "Maybe not, but it is deserved." Darius paused before answering. "People can only act on what they believe is true. The important thing is being willing to change when new information arrives." The statement settled over the cabin. It was not defensive. It was not critical. It was simply honest. Linda listened carefully. Those words affected her more than any criticism could have. She slowly walked toward seat 2A and stopped beside Darius. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Linda finally broke the silence. "Mr. Coleman, I am sorry." The cabin became quiet again. Darius looked up. Linda continued. "I should have checked the file when you first asked. I believed I already understood the situation." Darius nodded gently. "Thank you for saying that." Linda lowered her eyes. "I was wrong." Darius smiled. "What matters is what happens after we discover we are wrong." For the second time that day, Linda found herself without an answer. Because deep down, she knew he was right. Across the cabin, passengers reflected on the exchange. Nobody had expected the story to end this way. They expected arguments. They expected anger. Instead, they witnessed professionalism, patience, and dignity. Moments later, the aircraft door finally closed. The departure delay that had puzzled everyone was ending at last. Yet as the engines prepared for pushback, every person on board understood that they had witnessed something far more important than a travel disruption. They had witnessed what happens when assumptions collide with facts. And they had witnessed a man who never needed to announce his importance because his character spoke louder than any title ever could. As the aircraft finally pushed back from the gate, a quiet sense of closure settled throughout the cabin. The delay that had frustrated schedules and disrupted plans no longer seemed important. What remained in the minds of the passengers was the lesson they had witnessed. Outside the window, the terminal slowly moved away as evening light reflected across the aircraft. Inside first class, Darius Coleman sat comfortably in seat 2A, looking out toward the runway. He appeared exactly as he had appeared at the beginning of the day. Calm, professional, unmoved by attention. The difference was that everyone around him now understood why. Across the aisle, the businessman who had followed the entire situation shook his head and smiled. "I have spent 20 years in corporate leadership," he said quietly, "and I think I learned something today." Darius glanced toward him. "What was that?" The man laughed softly. "The most confident person in the room is usually the person who does not need to prove anything." Several nearby passengers nodded in agreement. It was difficult to argue with that observation. Throughout the entire ordeal, Darius had never raised his voice. He had never demanded special treatment. He had never announced his accomplishments. He simply asked for the records to be reviewed. The facts had done the rest. A few minutes later, Captain Michael Reed's voice came across the cabin speakers. He thanked everyone for their patience and confirmed that departure was underway. His announcement sounded routine, but passengers noticed one subtle difference. There was pride in his voice. Not because the flight was finally leaving, because the right decision had ultimately been made. Near the front galley, Linda Parker completed her final cabin checks before taking her jump seat. As she walked past first class, she briefly stopped beside Darius. "Thank you," she said quietly. Darius looked up. "For what?" Linda smiled. "For handling today the way you did." Darius considered the question for a moment. "Everyone makes mistakes." Linda nodded. "Not everyone responds to them with patience." For the first time all day, both of them shared a genuine smile. No tension remained. No embarrassment. Only understanding. As the aircraft accelerated down the runway, passengers looked out their windows while the city lights stretched across the horizon. Seconds later, the wheels lifted from the ground, and the aircraft climbed smoothly into the evening sky. A few passengers returned to work. Others opened books or closed their eyes. Yet many continued reflecting on the events they had witnessed. They arrived expecting an ordinary flight. Instead, they had received an unforgettable reminder about judgment, dignity, and respect. An hour later, as the aircraft cruised above the clouds, the businessman across the aisle looked toward Darius once more. "Do you know what surprises me most?" he asked. Darius smiled. "What is that?" The man leaned back in his seat. "After everything that happened, you still do not seem angry." Darius looked out the window at the fading sunlight above the clouds. Anger would not have changed the truth. The man considered that answer carefully. Darius continued, "People reveal a lot about themselves when they make assumptions. They reveal even more when they are willing to correct them." The businessman nodded slowly. It was the perfect ending to the story. Long after the flight landed, passengers would remember the delay. They would remember the empty first-class seat. They would remember the captain refusing to depart. But most of all, they would remember the man who never needed a title to command respect. Because true leadership is not measured by wealth, influence, or status. It is measured by character when circumstances become difficult. And on that flight, the strongest statement was never made through power. It was made through patience. The records revealed who Darius Coleman was. His actions revealed who he chose to be. And in the end, that mattered far more than any seat on any aircraft ever could.